everyone to our February conversations on social reproduction. I'm absolutely delighted today to welcome Professor Andrea Freeman, who's a professor of law at the University of Hawaii, William S. Richardson School of Law. And I'm absolutely thrilled that she will be joining King's College London very shortly on March 1st as our Fulbright research scholar. And she's studying inequality while she's at King's. So Professor Freeman writes and researches at the intersection of critical race theory and food policy, health and consumer credit. And she's the author of an absolutely terrific book, Skimmed, Breastfeeding, Race and Injustice, which is published by Stanford University Press in 2020. And she also has a new book forthcoming called Ruin Their Crops on the Ground, which is forthcoming in 2023. So she'll speak about her book Skimmed today, and I can't wait to hear her present this absolutely fantastic book. So over to you, Andrea. And I just want to inform everyone that we are recording this session, and I hope you're all okay with that. Thanks.
Thank you so much for that very kind introduction. I'm so excited to be there soon. It's been a long delayed process, so just could not come any sooner. And I want to also thank you for welcoming me, for letting me speak to everybody today, to everybody who is here today. Thank you. So we are having a little bit of technology issue, but here are my slides. I will be cueing slides, so try to ignore that portion of what I'm going to say. And I'm going to start, if you can start with the first slide, by showing you, so next. Great. So slides of the latest incarnation of the white supremacist obsession with milk. And these are protesters at a New York anti-Trump art installation called He Will Not Divide Us, where neo-Nazis danced shirtless, chugging jugs of milk, saying that their action demonstrated their opposition to the vegan agenda. And milk also entered the Twitterverse, replacing Pepe the Frog as the emoji symbolizing white superiority in the Twitter names of newsworthy white supremacists, including slide, Lawrence Fox, 2021 London mayoral candidate and actor, slide, Richard Spencer, president of the White Supremacist National Policy Institute and coiner of the term alt-right, and slide, social media personality Baked Alaska, otherwise known as Tim Treadstone Gionette, who took part in the January 6th Capitol riots in the US. Slide. White nationalist websites featured this poem and this map tracking lactose intolerance that shows Scandinavia as a lactase hotspot. And this went viral in their community. Slide. For movie fans, and I apologize for this spoiler, there's a terrifying scene in the Best Picture nominated film Get Out of a white supremacist slowly sipping on a glass of milk while eating dry Fruit Loops from a separate bowl to ensure that the cereal would not destroy her drink's purity. And this association between white supremacy and milk is not new. It's been around for about 100 years. Slide. In the 1920s, a National Dairy Council pamphlet explained that the people who've used liberal amounts of milk and its products, meaning white people, are progressive in science and every activity of the human intellect. Slide. This 1933, thank you. History of Agriculture of the State of New York declared also that a casual look at the races show that the Aryans, the heaviest drinkers of milk, are of quick and high development. And a few years ago in my article, The Unbearable Whiteness of Milk, slide, I explored how food law and policy also have a racist impact, slide. Milk consumption is linked to serious illnesses and conditions, including several types of cancer, heart disease, MS, and cognitive decline. And it's also responsible for the less serious condition of lactose intolerance, slide. The majority of almost every racial group except for white people from Northern Europe and Scandinavia, suffer from lactose intolerance. Slide. Northern Europeans had to adapt to their cold, hostile climate by drinking their herd's milk, and they developed the ability to retain the enzyme lactase and passed it to their descendants. So even the phrase lactose intolerance is racially biased. With most of the world unable to digest milk, it would make a lot more sense to call people who can digest it lactose persistent. But instead, whiteness forms the baseline of normal, and any deviation from it is labeled abnormal and undesirable. Slide. Since the 1930s, the US government has been committed to supporting dairy farmers. And in 1977, President Jimmy Carter vowed to increase the price of milk to 6 cents a gallon. The government bought surplus milk to get and keep the price down, but it couldn't store milk for very long, so it bought cheese. Slide. After every cold storage in the United States was filled with cheese, the government rented half an acre in a Kansas cave and filled it from floor to ceiling with cheese. Slide. Eventually, the US had 2 pounds of stored cheese for every one of its residents. Slide. The government sent powdered milk to people in other countries who had trouble digesting it as foreign aid, but they couldn't transport cheese overseas. So instead, slide, they delivered it to poor neighborhoods, a plan that wouldn't affect the price of milk because the people who received it couldn't afford to buy it on the market otherwise. Slide. Bringing large quantities of cheese into Black and brown communities made the racial disparities in milk-related diseases, conditions, and deaths worse. So did slide, developing the special milk program for public schools, slide, counting pizza as a vegetable, slide, and letting fast food companies advertise on school buses, slide, working with fast food companies to develop cheesier products, slide, giving milk its own section on the dietary guidelines, and slide, sending huge blocks of cheese in the food distribution program for Indian reservations. And all of these are examples of what I call slide food oppression. So food oppression, facially neutral, food-related law, policy, or government practice, creating health disparities along race, gender, and class lines. The food, agricultural, and pharmaceutical industry's influence over policy drives these disparities. And cultural myths about personal responsibility that ignore the structural determinants of what we eat, as well as racial stereotypes about laziness and poor choices, make these disparities seem natural when they're not. So this work on milk in the context of food oppression led me to think about breast milk and first food oppression. And I came across the story of Annie Mae Fultz. Slide. Annie Mae was a Black and Cherokee woman from Reidsville, North Carolina, who lost the ability to hear and speak in childhood. And she was married to Slide Pete, who was a tenant farmer 20 years older than her. They had 6 children already when she learned that she was pregnant with triplets. And on her doctor's orders, she left the tobacco farm to stay in the hospital a few weeks ahead of the birth. And when her daughters finally arrived at 1 a.m. on May 23rd, 1946, she was surprised, slide, by a 4th baby hiding behind her sisters. Slide. Annie Mae's perfect babies became instant celebrities, reported on by papers all over the country. Universal Studios even sent a film crew from LA to capture the event. Annie Mae's doctor, slide, Fred Klenner, was white, and he was an unapologetic racist. And you can see some of this in these slides, because in this one, he's holding baby Anne at a distance. And in the next one, you'll see that he's having the nurse hold her. Now, he was a vocal supporter of Hitler, who he called misunderstood. He also believed he could cure anything from gum disease to polio with vitamin C. And he seized the opportunity that he saw in the girl's fame to try to prove his controversial theories. and he started injecting the girls with 50 milligrams of vitamin C on the day that they were born. By doing this, Klenner continued the horrific practice of medical personnel experimenting on Black subjects without intending to benefit them. Slide. Then, ignoring the names that Annie Mae lovingly picked out for her daughters, he gave them all the first name Mary, then the names of his wife, sister, aunt, and great aunt, Anne Louise, Alice, and Catherine. Finally, he started a bidding war among formula companies competing to become the girls' corporate godfather. Slide. St. Louis's, that's okay, all right. St. Louis's Pet Milk Company won the rights to use the sisters in their promotional materials. And through the contract, Klenner managed to maintain control over the girls until they became adults. He had Pet Milk buy some barren land from his father-in-law for the family and install, quote, slide, a window in their nursery where people paid to look at the girls on the weekends, like a human zoo. Slide. He kept the girls isolated from other kids. Slide. Including their siblings, a couple of whom you also saw looking in the window of the nursery in the previous slide. And he had Pet Milk, slide, hire nurses from his hospitals to live with them so he could continue his experiments on them. And because of her duties and her disabilities, Annie Mae couldn't travel with the girls. So their nurses, slide, went to Washington, D.C. with them for a feature sponsored by, slide, Ebony magazine. And while they were there, although no politician would agree to meet with these Black celebrities, they ran into President Truman. Slide. Truman thought they were pretty, and he took this iconic picture with them. And the girls in their travels experienced things that their parents could only dream of. Slide. Staying in hotels, going on airplanes, slide, appearing on television, and marching in parades. While Pet Milk sales went through the roof. 3 slides in a row. Look at these ads. But the girls lived in poverty all their lives. And when they turned 6 and they were ready for school, slide, Dr. Klenner convinced a judge to take them away from their family and to make nurse Elma Saylor and her husband Charles their guardians. Elma convinced Pet Milk to extend the contract, slide, until the girls turned 18, slide. And when they were 18, they met another president, slide. There they are with JFK. Now, the girls never did well educationally and were asked to leave college after struggling for 2 years. And the Sailors moved them up to Peekskill, where they tried unsuccessfully to break into the Manhattan nightclub scene. Slide. They had a great quads singing group. Now, all 4 sisters were diagnosed with breast cancer at the age of 45. And by age 55, Catherine, slide, was the only sister left. And she passed away in October 2018. So Pet Milk's campaign featuring the girls was the first to target Black families to buy anything except for, slide, cigarettes, alcohol, and beauty products. In the first half of the 20th century, switch the slide, please. If you can. Okay, great. Oh, okay, keep going. Sorry. Okay, I'm missing one, but it's fine. In the first half of the 20th century, companies believed in a trickle-down theory of marketing, that Black consumers would want whatever white consumers wanted. But of course, they were wrong. And the adorable light-skinned Fultz sisters, as seen in the previous slide, were the perfect models for a crossover campaign that opened the door to a new era of marketing of formula and other products. And formula was necessary for many Black women because they couldn't afford the luxury of staying home to nurse their babies. Even when welfare, introduced in response to the Great Depression of the 1930s, began to offer support for single mothers it excluded most Black women. Later, when more Black and brown women began to receive welfare, attitudes toward the program changed, and it started to look more like a handout than a government responsibility. Slide. In 1996, temporary assistance for needy families made it possible for states to require new mothers to go to work as soon as their babies were born or lose their benefits. Slide. Several states forced mothers to give up the labor that they did at home to do low-wage or low-skilled work outside the home. And in these types of jobs, slide, breastfeeding is nearly impossible. Slide. Employers that see their workers as disposable and interchangeable don't provide paid breaks or safe spaces to pump milk. The US has no federal law requiring employers to give parental leave. And 2/3 of women who bring suits against their employers for breastfeeding discrimination just end up losing their jobs. The laws and policies that make it difficult for new mothers to breastfeed disproportionately harm Black women, who have the lowest rates of breastfeeding in the United States. And their rates are low even compared to Latina mothers who have a similar socioeconomic status. And people support laws and policies that create obstacles to breastfeeding largely because of widespread stereotypes about Black mothers, like the welfare queen. Slide. In the popular imagination, the welfare queen is a single deviant Black mother who has children just so she can get benefits to spend on luxury cars, purses, and fancy food. And this myth grew from stereotypes born during chattel slavery to justify, slide, the cruel separation of Black mothers and children. And the modern welfare queen combines elements of Mammy, Jezebel, and Sapphire. So slide. Mammy was the perfect caretaker of white children, but she neglected her own. And this myth made stealing enslaved women's breast milk to give to white babies seem logical. Slide. Jezebel was a lustful Black woman who could never be raped because she always desired sex. Slide. Sapphire was a sharp-tongued ball-buster, another slide, without a maternal bone in her body. Slide. And the lie of the bad Black mother continues today through slide, popular culture, and news media. It explains why images of breastfeeding mothers are almost always white, and almost the only images of Black mothers breastfeeding are in slide, formula ads, and slide, National Geographic. Slide. The reality is that breastfeeding is hard for almost everyone. Slide. But doctors and nurses are not trained to give lactation advice. And they assume that Black women just don't want to breastfeed, so they offer them formula instead of help. Hospitals in Black neighborhoods, slide, have fewer baby-friendly practices, like rooming babies and moms together. Predominantly Black cities, slide, are often first food deserts that lack resources for new mothers. People attack Black women for breastfeeding in public. Slide. The USDA, U.S. Department of Agriculture, gives formula away for free to women who participate in the special supplemental food program for women, infants, and children. But, slide, they don't give away organic or healthier formulas. Slide. And the USDA gets rebates from the formula companies for these giveaways that pay for most of the WIC program. Pediatricians give out free formula in their offices to get perks like conference funding from the formula companies. The US is the only country that refuses to sign on to an international agreement prohibiting formula marketing to pregnant people and to new parents, and that would limit, slide, race-targeted marketing. Another slide. And then the next slide. At the 2018 World Health Assembly, when Ecuador proposed a resolution promoting breastfeeding, slide, the US threatened it with trade and aid sanctions until it withdrew it. Black parents and infants suffer from health problems and conditions linked to formula feeding, including infant mortality, at much higher rates than other mothers and babies. And the effects of this first food oppression were devastating at the beginning of the pandemic, when formula disappeared from the shelves and formula companies refused to take responsibility for the years that they spent steering Black women away from breastfeeding. Now, the solution to first food oppression is complex. Corporate interests and influence need to be separated from U.S. nutrition programs. The government needs to regulate formula marketing, and we need a complete reimagining of the workplace from a feminist perspective. It's also time, slide, to tell new stories about Black motherhood. 2 more slides. Beyonce. I had to end on Beyonce. Okay. So that's what I prepared to share with you, and I just love to open it up to a discussion now to get your thoughts and feedback.
Thank you, Andrea. Thank you so much for that really terrific presentation. I think it captures very nicely the gist of so many of the chapters of the book in a really memorable way. So now we open up to our discussion and questions for Andrea. You can just raise your hand or just voice your question. I think maybe while people collect their thoughts, can I just ask you about the role of the law in this? I mean, it's a spectacular story of the failure of the law, but which is often the story that feminists tell, right? I mean, but what really struck me about your book was how laws at various levels somehow layer up and produce the most perverse of results, right? Right from the beginning, like the ability to name a child, to separate the children from the parent, and the fact that even the child of one of the daughters is then taken away from her and sent for adoption, and then of course the more familiar story of industry lobbying laws and how they influence medical associations and doctors, and how this all then relates to welfare law and then international law and constitutional law. How is it that these laws all seem to layer onto each other to produce the worst possible result? And where would you think are the points of intervention for feminist reimagining of what is really coming together of the laws of social reproduction?
Yes, that is a very, very wonderful way of putting how complex this problem is and how it works on so many levels and has to be attacked on so many levels. And one driver that I think is so important is social movement and awareness, because I think the fact that it is operating on so many different ways, it's operating on a federal level, an international level, a state level, a corporate level, means that without sort of, people just don't know. Even the story of the Fultz sisters, which I think is an incredible story, and you've referenced other parts of it that I didn't even mention in this talk, right? About one of the girls getting pregnant, her baby being taken away because it would look bad for pet milk, and her spending her whole life trying to find her baby again, right? Just so many compelling aspects to it. And yet this is basically an untold story, right? People haven't heard about it when you think it would be well known. So I think that just the fact that it's about Black women, it's a story that affects everybody, but affects Black women the most. And Black women are in the United States the least valued. And so just to raise awareness and to make the connections between, with so many of these movements, if we put Black women first, then the justice will follow for everybody. And I think that if people heard about it more, if people thought about it more, if people saw how it impacts their own lives, particularly, with the larger food oppression picture, with kids in school, right? There's a hook for all of us. But I think without that awareness and without social will to make changes, it's going to be almost impossible.
Thank you. Thanks. I think Annalisa has a question.
I was just wondering about kind of two kind of small questions in terms of the laws when the quads were taken away from their mother legally. How much of that was to do with her disability and how much was to do with race, or is it not explicit in the documentation? And secondly, I was just wondering, in terms of the state of play at the moment in America, I've been watching various videos, and it really struck me the difference in the UK to America in terms of giving birth. The way in the UK women are encouraged in general, if you're not, you know, on a drip or anything, to walk around, etc. And it's been really obvious to me in videos that, you know, women are not encouraged to do that so much in America. And I was wondering, when you say about there not being a lactation consultant, do women get any, after giving birth, any kind of advice on breastfeeding in the States at the moment, or not at all?
Oh yeah, those are great questions. So I think that it was not because of her disability that the girls were taken, because, you know, she had these 6 other kids, and you know, no one was concerned about them. So I really think it didn't have anything to do with her parenting. So I would say it is about race, because it was the will of this white doctor just making it happen, and having the knowledge and access to the system to go to the court and even know how to request that and demand it, and then the complicity and the belief that whatever the white people thought would be best for the family would be best for the family, right? So that's fascinating about the video. I'd love to see that. Yes, I think you've really hit the nail on the head there, that services for women giving birth in the United States are terrible, right? We have extremely high maternal mortality. There's just not a focus on care. And this, the giving of lactation advice and the helping is part of that system, right? And it also leads to these terrible mortality results. And I think that's another connection that hasn't been made as often, because there's a lot of thinking about what's happening in the process of giving birth and then not as much about what's happening after. But you're absolutely correct in your observation that it's really about the doctors here, and it's not about the people giving birth.
Yeah, I know recently there was a report about Black women in this country being 3 times more likely to die in childbirth. You know, as well. So, you know, I feel like this is a pervasive issue in multiple places.
Yeah, and in the US, it's Black women who suffer at the highest rates from that, right? And that's tied into a lot of racism in the medical system, beliefs that Black women, you know, not only are not smart and cannot diagnose their own problems, but that they feel pain in a different way. You know, all kinds of internalized racism that's been around since slavery to justify slavery.
Are there other questions for Andrea?
Or comments or anything people want to share on their own experiences or thoughts or related topics?
Andrea, I want to go back to your initial observation around, you know, what it would take to actually change the legal infrastructure to make this, you know, to recognize this food oppression and to correct it. So I just wondered if you could place for us on a spectrum sort of internationally, because you also talk about the other countries that have, you know, far more sort of progressive laws around this question. Can you just, and it's very evident that the US is at one end of that spectrum, but can you say a little bit more about what are the techniques that are being used in other parts of the world, you know, especially where they have, you know, follow the WHO directions on, the advertising, against advertising of formula?
Yeah, the marketing is really important, and I think it's something we can overlook often. But I think that the most important thing is giving support, and the fact that the U.S. is so terrible at supporting people, any kind of social welfare. So the fact that it is so difficult for people after they have babies to stay home with them, right? That there's just, it's go out to work, and the poorer you are, the sooner you have to go out to work, right? And there's just no time, there's no money, there's no access to either a way to pump at work or a way to much more ideally have your baby near you while you work, or a break to actually be with them, right? So the whole structure of society and of work goes against the possibility of breastfeeding, right? Which resonates to everybody throughout the population, but it's seen as a problem for, for poor families, for Black families, undervalued families.
And, but you also talk about how, like, Norway and the Scandinavian countries, how they kind of deal with this issue. So it's a question of many, I guess, legal moves to value care work of parents in general that seems to make quite a difference. I think
it's also interesting thinking about Norway, right? Because it is so successful and is such a model. But also I always have to think about how it's so heterogeneous, right? And so they just don't have the kind of issues, their social welfare program is not structured around a racist society. It's not rooted in a racist society. So everybody feels they're benefiting from whatever is given, right? Because we have this very perverse system in the United States where even white people who would benefit from welfare and other social systems, medical care, are against it because they think it will help, people of color. So it's very complicated. And I think it's just easier for a country like Norway to institute programs like that where everyone's on board.
But if I read right, they also reversed the initial impulse to feed on formula. So that seemed like there was a story of a successful social movement as well. I mean, and do you think it's because also of the homogeneous nature of the population that was something that could find traction compared to the US, that kind of reversal?
Yeah, that's interesting. I don't know if that's just education.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. I mean, I hesitate to think too much about education as a solution because that's got all kinds of implications, for just it's how you frame education, right? Is it that people can't learn or they don't have access to the knowledge? But I think that a lot of people, because of the insidious marketing, really do believe that formula is as good as or better than breastfeeding, when it is like objectively, factually not.
Mm-hmm.
Right? There's a lot of concern as well about guilt and parents feeling bad about if they have to use formula, and that being used as a reason, right, not to push how formula is not as strong and not as healthy. But I also consider that kind of infantilizing of parents, right, that they wouldn't be able to take in that information and still make the decisions they need to make.
Mm-hmm. Terrific. I think we have Sharda and then Sheila. Go ahead.
Wants to show their faces too. That's great too.
Yeah. Am I audible?
Yeah.
Yes.
Yeah. I mean, I just had a comment to make because I found the whole, I just started reading the book and I thought it was really fascinating. And when I was at law school, we had learned about a similar case of a Black woman. Her name was Henrietta Lacks, and how, you know, her cells were taken. And I realized that these things were happening quite close to each other in terms of time and probably space also. So I thought that was really interesting. And if you're aware of the story, if you found any similarities beyond these superficial ones that I saw.
Oh, yes, I agree. The story of Henrietta Lacks is also sad and really rooted in medical racism and the idea that, you know, it's okay to exploit Black women's bodies for the sort of general good, meaning like white society's good, without giving back to either that person, that family, or that community, or even giving credit. They're both incredible stories that are very sad, and we have a lot to learn from.
Sheila?
Apologies, I'm having technical issues, so I hope you can hear me, but I can't turn on my camera at the minute.
I can hear you.
Thank you for a fascinating paper. So I had two questions. One was, and I haven't read the book, so apologies about that, but I have ordered it and I'm now looking forward to reading it.
Sure.
One was about, you say, you know, that this story was just unknown or it's not discussed, which does seem really shocking given the facts. And I was wondering, is there any movement to recognise what has happened to the family in this situation? And apologies if I missed out on any detail. Like, you know, so I'm based at Bristol, and recently we've unveiled a statue to Henrietta Lacks, and there's increased acknowledgement, probably as a result of the film in some senses, but I think a drive to recognise what happened. And I wondered if there's similar kind of campaigns or advocacy with regard to this family. And the second point relates to pressures around feeding, and this again could be to do with different contexts, but almost, I mean, comparing the maternal health care in the UK and the US is interesting with regard to the medicalisation, but actually with regard to breastfeeding and the messaging around breastfeeding, often what is a concern here, what I've come across, is where people aren't supported in not breastfeeding, right? So there's huge issues around lack of support. One of the previous questioners mentioned you know, being encouraged to get up out of bed, and this is regardless of mode of birth. So if you've had a section, and if you aren't able to breastfeed, for example, a common example that's used is people being encouraged, well, you have to go get your own formula or whatever, you know, you have to do. You hear kind of some negative stories around the supports that are offered. And I wondered what your view is in light of what you've uncovered in your research, but around the ideology and messaging on feeding options across the board, so be it breastfeeding or formula feeding, and the kind of the what kind of a social reproduction model can kind of do for informing health policy in that area. And I'm thinking as well about how often breastfeeding is described as economically a good option, but of course that just doesn't recognize the labor of the person who's feeding or the time involved. What you thought about how health policy could be informed by taking seriously these sorts of concerns, but also is there a possibility for a non-ideologically or non-guilty kind of health policy or information strategy here that recognizes many options of feeding as equally valuable?
Great. Thanks. So much to think about. So to your first question, which I love, it's something much on my mind, of course, as I, you know, think about disseminating the story and the family, and the family has never received any compensation from pet milk or anything, and like what I might be able to do. So I'm working with a director and trying to develop a documentary on the topic, which I think will be hopefully a vehicle to trying to get some compensation, either through the company or I'm not sure. That's really interesting what you said about, I want to hear more about that, the Henrietta Lacks statue, because I don't know who's behind it, but somebody's paying for that, which I assume would be the government there, or I don't know. Anyway, so that's inspiring. And that's one of the main goals that I have going forward of trying to disseminate the work. You know, an academic book, as I'm sure most people know here, is not like a definitely a way to reach a lot of people, right? So I'm hoping to have a stronger impact with a film that might lead to better results for the family. And I'm really happy you brought up what you did about, you know, the modeling and the guilt and that, because some, I don't know, critics, but, you know, some things that I've heard about my book and my position is that it's too promoting of breastfeeding, you know, and doesn't take into account people's choice. But really, my message is choice. And my drive to the project is that Black women in the United States have rarely had choice. And so I, you know, myself had to use formula with my kids. I have premature twins, and you know, I don't try to spend too much time thinking I did the wrong thing or it was bad, right? Everybody has to make a choice, but many people don't have choice. And so if I understood what you were saying correctly, I think that is the important model, right? Is that here's not just information, but access to whatever you need. And then there's no judgment on the choice. Does that respond to what you're saying?
Yes, and I guess it speaks as well to the points you were making about if you want to promote breastfeeding, you need to give people time and space to do it, but also probably make sure economically they have capacity to do it by recognizing that this is, you know, by in some way recognizing that time, either through appropriate maternity leave, but even in return to work settings, about how you facilitate feeding in those contexts.
Yeah,
so,
I mean,
yeah.
it's a complete lie to frame breastfeeding as a personal choice or preference, and particularly as a cultural one, right? Because it's not about that. Every parent wants to do the best for their kid, and every person is working within constraints, right? But unless we can see what those constraints are and then try to remove them, then these are not real choices at all.
Yeah, thank you.
Mm-hmm.
Any other questions? I know there are some colleagues here who worked on surrogacy, and I think surrogacy in India, where, you know, obviously, like, you know, surrogates would also, you know, give their milk, you know, for the baby that they delivered. So there's some kind of wet nursing that goes on after the baby has been handed over. So, and also the formation of milk banks, you know, also around this issue. So I just wondered if anyone had wanted to share their work on this. Maybe Madhushri, do you want to do you have a question around that?
Hello, everybody. Am I audible?
Yes.
So first of all, I would like to say it was a very fascinating presentation, and this is something I had really didn't have much idea on, but it was a really nice presentation, and I enjoy it. So yeah, so what we see in India is that it is the same thing. It's in India, what is a racist thing that what we are seeing here in US, it's from a racial perspective, but in India it's most of a, you know, it's a class perspective that we see here, because the surrogates that you know, they come from a very, you know, disadvantaged socioeconomic background, and yeah, so their bodies are, you know, kind of being used as a means of production, and you know, they're just, you know, their bodies are, you know, conditioned, like, you know, they are pumping, like their bodies are pumped with, you know, hormonal injections, and they give birth of the babies, and then some of the surrogates, they are allowed to breastfeed the babies. And while I've come across, you know, during my surveys, that some of the surrogates don't even want to see the babies after they're born, and then again they are, you know, given a lot of injections and medications to stop, the secretion of breast milk. So yeah, that is also what I found a little, definitely problematic from a, like feminist perspective. Yeah, but yeah, your work was definitely very interesting, and I'm looking forward to, reading your book.
Well, your work sounds amazing. I would love to hear more about it or read anything that you've written.
Oh, yeah, sure. Definitely will love to share my work with you.
Yeah, I think Madhushree has an article. Maybe you can share your link, a link to your article on surrogacy. Sandy, I mean, just sort of going with, I guess a lot of the feminist legal scholars in the US have talked about, reproductive justice. And I think you also talk about intersectionality and, using critical race theory. So I just wondered how, your intervention on this question, breastfeeding connects up to, those literatures. And I think the second thing was also, I mean, I know that there is a lot of momentum around food studies, certainly in US law schools. I know that there are quite a few sort of centers popping up. And I just wondered how your idea of food oppression, which sounds, just so apt. I mean, especially in a country like India, where we have massive stocks of, food grains, but also very, very high levels of malnutrition. What is the impulse not to distribute, right? I mean, so I'm just curious this idea of food oppression, how that connects up with food studies in general and lawyers working on food studies.
Yeah, thanks. It's been interesting because there has been this sort of surge of interest in food studies in the US, but there has not been a sort of going along with it, this critical race theory perspective. When I started talking about this, I guess, I don't know, about 10 years ago, I thought, this is the beginning and more people are going to join me, but it really, it's a very white space, food studies. There are extensive food justice movements in the US, but not in the sort of legal academy. So I'm still finding, I'm at a conference and I'm the only one saying the word racism or feminism or whatever, which that's not right. It really, there's no way to think about the food system either in the US or internationally without thinking about racism, intersectionality, all these things. So I think the US is behind. I'm really interested to start my study of the UK to see how things are there. And when I tried to do some preliminary research, I did not see in the legal space many people working on that. I think it's hard for people to make the connection between critical race theory and food oppression and food injustice from both sides. So not only from trying to get food studies people thinking about it, but also racial justice. A lot of the, I read extensively in this area, and a lot of it is like a paragraph, and if we're lucky, maybe a chapter, thinking about food and the way that food has affected oppression among communities. And so I just really hope that more people start thinking about it and talking about it and making the connections. Sheila is going to tell us something interesting about that.
No, not at all. I had a question. It sounds really interesting. Is it okay to ask another question? Sorry.
Please. Yeah, please.
So is the suggestion then, or is the theme that comes out of your work, and I'm thinking about it also in relation to the really interesting surrogacy work we just heard about, that milk becomes commodified in some spaces, but it's not a commodity to which everyone's entitled, right? So the value of milk, is that the suggestion, that the commodity is that there's a danger in milk becoming commodified in that way? Because it's making me rethink some of what I was thinking about how we value them breastfeed, what sort of value we want to place in breastfeeding in order to facilitate it, if that makes sense.
It's really interesting thinking about the social valuation of breastfeeding, right? Because they used to believe during slavery that Black women's breast milk was better, right? That this was a biological fact. And that continued past the period of enslavement into the sort of like wet nurse, domestic labor time when Black women were restricted to those jobs and still being forced really through economic means, right, to breastfeed white people's children. There was this belief, but at the same time, this racism that they didn't want to, to taint their family or their children with the milk. Very complex, right? And then we see a period of actually now it's white women who should be breastfeeding, in the sort of leisurely 1950s housewife type thing. So it's like on and off and on and off as to whether milk is valued. But the actual purchase of milk, and probably you had mentioned milk banks, and I would be interested to hear more how those operate in India and other countries, right? Again, you see the exploitation in the US of these banks trying to buy at very low prices Black women's breast milk and then sell it at very high prices, right? So it's just the same economic exploitation that you'd see in any industry, but there's just so much attached to it when it's about, Black women's reproductive value and all this. So the commodification and value of breast milk is fascinating. You've got Lady Gaga selling her breast milk and making it into ice cream, right? And that's like, I don't know if it's a novelty item or a luxury item, but there's a lot of layers there.
Sorry, I'm furiously taking notes. I think this is just so fascinating.
I'm curious to end on Lady Gaga's breast milk ice cream. Maybe that is the right part.
Yeah, no, that's totally fine. But I think, I think in the future it would be also good to hear, how feminists clearly, in a sense, feminists may have quite different positions on the recognition of the right to breastfeed. And I'd welcome that, because I know that certainly in the US context, these battles are quite, people have very strong positions, and it often translates into legal contestations, unlike in other parts of the world. But I just wondered if you could say a little bit about that, because of the cultural feminism and also, radical feminism and so on, how that plays out in this context.
I found that really interesting too, that some feminists, and it relates back to what we've been discussing, right? But push back on the idea of promoting breastfeeding as something in itself oppressive, right? A sort of movement to keep women at home or in domestic roles, instead of seeing it as something empowering that helps women, that all women should have access to the choice to do it if they want to, but structurally, not personally, right? That society would be structured in a way that if you want to, you can. If you don't want to, you don't have to. But there's quite a lot of, there are people with strong voices, right, against promoting breastfeeding, and even suggesting that breastfeeding itself is a corporate interest, right, is like a moneymaker and is a way to oppress, to make money. It doesn't actually make sense, but there's this book that was like somewhat popular called Lactivism, right, just critiquing the promotion of breastfeeding, and also some kind of twisted ways about how, because so many Black women use formula, we should not degrade formula to do so as racist, which is like turning the logic on its head, right? But I've seen that as well as a so-called feminist thing. But my take on all of this, really the takeaway, is that white feminism is not interested in Black women's problems. And I think that this problem is so centrally located among the Black women's health and, like I said, maternal mortality and all those issues, that it's just something that the majority of white feminists don't care about, because their issues are different, right? They're more what Sheila was talking about, like, hey, it's not about, that we can't breastfeed, it's that we're being shamed because we don't want to, right? And so then to that's the feminist issue. And they can't even imagine the world where actually it's the opposite, right? Because so many white people are vocally saying that they're being, shamed and being pressured. And to them, that's a feminist issue. Not, Sheila, I'm not saying all that you said that, because you didn't.
Thank you. I think that was really fascinating. Are there any final comments or observations or questions for Andrea?
Well, I want to thank you for having this discussion, and everybody who's here. It's been great to connect with you, and I hope to continue connecting. And if anybody has any follow-up thoughts, please reach out. I would love to hear them and to connect further.
Absolutely. And we look forward to seeing you in person very, very, very soon. And I think this has been wonderful, actually, because I think one of the things around social reproduction is that the focus so much is on care work or domestic work. I think there's a lot less focus on food as also, quite vital for social reproduction. And this idea of first food and food inequality, I think it's quite fascinating. And it just takes one back. Certainly in the Indian context, there's been some fantastic work, like Mahashweta Devi's very famous, story, the breast giver, and how the woman the Brahmin woman who nurses, the children of the household that she works in, and finally dies of breast cancer when, there's absolutely no medical care for her. And, it's about what happens to women's reproductive labor in a very, poignant fashion. So I think you've given us a lot to think about, and look forward to seeing you in person. Thanks.
Thank you so much.
Thank you. Thank you, everyone.